Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on some of the most pressing news stories of the day from around the world. I'm Siddhantani and this is the People's Dispatch studio in New Delhi. And today we're talking about everyone's favorite social media platform, Facebook, Peru's new cabinet, the vaccine policy at the Australian Open, and the striking story of Claudette Colvin. First up, the Facebook papers. On this show, we seem to be talking about Facebook a lot, and that's likely to continue in the future with these kind of revelations that are coming out. A variety of news organizations around the world, 17 in the US and Europe, have come out and published these revelations. They are based on documents obtained from whistleblower Francis Haugen and reveal a company facing a crisis on multiple fronts and failing to handle it. In fact, Facebook's rank and file hotly debated its policies and warned its leadership about its effects on society and politics in the United States. To discuss this further, we have veteran journalist and author Paranjoy Guha Thakurta in studio. Paranjoy, good to have you on Daily Debrief. First up, what are the Facebook papers and what do they contain?
The whistleblower has come out with a huge volume of information. These are internal documents and internal records of Facebook. And what has been disclosed is, at one level, something that was known, but nevertheless very, very alarming. And that is that it didn't do much to check information that was false, fake, incendiary, and likely to promote hate.
Right.
We know Facebook has a terrible track record in large parts of the world, notably Myanmar, Sri Lanka. It was always when other media organizations highlighted that they had been turning a blind eye to all the hateful information that they take action. So the point is, when you have a revenue model which is predicated on virality, you just want the content to go viral. You don't care whether it's correct or false, whether it's hateful, whether it will result in tensions. And the point is, India seems to feature very, very prominently in the documents that have been revealed and the information that has been revealed by Francis Haugen. But the point is very simple. India is the biggest market for Facebook. I mean, India has 340 million users of Facebook.
Right.
I mean, forget WhatsApp. WhatsApp has over 450 million. And we know that this is the same organization. It's Facebook, it's WhatsApp, it's Instagram. So that's the highest in the world. And what we see is internally, what its own staffers were saying, Mr. Mark Zuckerberg and company chose to look the other way. And a country like India, which has its biggest user base, it spends a negligible fraction of all the money it's spending. I mean, over 80%, 87% of its budget on tackling misinformation is spent in the US and in North America, which accounts for barely 10% of the total number of users of Facebook. Right. And Facebook claims it has spent in the last 5 years over $13 billion on tens of thousands of people. But what is very clear is they've just not done enough. Let me just give you two bits of information. A researcher for Facebook wrote that the algorithm encourages, in fact, celebrates violence, hate speech. And the researcher wrote, I quote, "I've seen more images of dead people in the past 3 weeks than I have seen in my entire life." So the point is, they claim that they're doing due diligence. They're saying that we are going to do more to check hateful content, but there is evidence to show they're doing very, very little. In fact, Alan Rusbridger, who's a journalist and a member of the oversight board, the so-called independent oversight board of Facebook, said it is well known that the algorithms reward emotional content that polarizes communities, and that makes it more addictive. Right. So these are some of the important revelations that have come out.
A few weeks ago when Facebook went down for about 6 hours, the half joke was that this is 6 hours when Facebook doesn't have a chance to destabilize democracy somewhere in the world. In your opinion, what's been the most tangible sort of impact of this profit over safety or promoting engagement and virality at all costs kind of policy?
Facebook has always been supportive of those in power, but we are seeing a pushback gradually. It's been particularly supportive of right-wing regimes, demagogues. It's bots, it's robots, it's fake accounts have more often than not been linked to such political parties, and they have been misused to spread hatred. And despite all the claims they make, the point is, what we see is just their greed for more profit makes them completely oblivious of the social and the political consequences of the kind of information that is disseminated on this global monopoly. I mean, it's a monopolistic digital platform.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So Facebook, of course, a story that we will keep a close eye on, and all the revelations that come out as those papers are published. Moving on now to Peru, where the opposition-led Congress pushed back a confirmation vote on the country's new cabinet until next Thursday. The reason was the sudden death of a lawmaker. This increases the uncertainty over the fate of the new cabinet led by Prime Minister Mirta Vázquez. This is the second cabinet to be nominated by left-wing President Pedro Castillo, who won a historic election a few months ago. We spoke to People's Dispatch's Zoe for the details on this.
Peru continues to be a place to keep our eyes on. Currently, the government of Pedro Castillo is attempting to approve the new cabinet that he has formed for the government. As we know, we were following in the past couple of weeks, following pressure from the right wing. Many members of the cabinet were forced to resign, and specifically members from his own party, the Peru Libre Party, who are of a more leftist tendency, including Héctor Bejar, Guido Bellido. Key members of the cabinet were forced to resign, and Pedro Castillo created a new cabinet that was met with opposition, not only from the right. The right has continued to say that this is not good enough. They want less left-wing, members in this cabinet, but the Peru Libre Party itself has also manifested their discontent with the new cabinet and also with the process of little by little squeezing them out of the government and forcing them out of the government that they feel that they helped to win. However, this process of approval of the cabinet was recently today put on hold following the tragic death of Fernando Herrera Mamani. He actually had a heart attack in the middle of the session when they were debating in Congress. And so this was, seen as a very big shock to all members of his own party, Peru Libre Party, to the Congress. And in the wake of this very tragic death, Pedro Castillo has called for unity. And it is a real moment in where people are looking and saying that, this political crisis, which has began since the elections were held in June, where the far right has put a tremendous amount of pressure, both on the Peru Libre Party, on Pedro Castillo himself, forcing them to make concessions, forcing a situation of instability. And so in this context, the death of this congressman is, of course, seen with a lot of worry. People very concerned that this new cabinet will not be approved. People concerned on the impact of these right-wing pressures that have forced so many members of the left-wing party out of the cabinet. And so it is a situation that we'll be looking out for in the next couple of days. When this cabinet gets approved by Congress and, what are the steps they're going to take. Pedro Castillo has also been, quite clear or made declarations that he is not going to threaten private interests, that he's not going to threaten rights of companies. I think, as we suspected, the government is facing a lot of pressure, given its very, openly radical and leftist agenda that they, ran for back during the campaign in June and in May, in April. And so we're starting to see how the right, given that the electoral victory of the left, how they're continuing to put on pressure, trying to exercise different ways. we'll see how they react when the vote does come up for the approval of the new cabinet, and what actions they will take within the legislative and within the judicial realm, because we also have to remember that several members of the Peru Libre Party have been unjustly accused of financial crimes, of different charges, which many of them have contested, saying that these are unfounded, that they don't have, that there still is not any proof to back them up, whereas many members of the right-wing parties are actually implicated in several corruption schemes, which have been widely denounced and information widely available. Much of this information came out, for example, in Pandora Papers, in other previous leaks, showing members of the right-wing parties, such as Popular Force, the party of Keiko Fujimori, benefiting from corruption deals with, for example, Odebrecht and other big companies. So it's a moment of great tension in Peru that continues to be focused in the legislative realm. Also important to remember that in the past year, before these elections were held, there was a political and institutional crisis, following the impeachment of the former president, and then the successive kind of attacks on this position. The interim president was also sacked from power, and there was a successive open presidency, which has sparked a lot of distrust among the people within the political system in Peru. And the people really, what they want is stability, and for the government to be able to carry out the necessary policies that the Peruvian people need.
On to the Australian Open now, where the organizers of one of the four majors in the sport of tennis have done a U-turn on their policy for international players. Australia has had one of the hardest COVID-19 lockdowns in the world, and travel both to and from is still severely restricted. Unlike last year though, the event will be open to the public, which has led to some debate on international players' status and how they'll be let into the country. While the organizers were initially following the government line of only allowing fully vaccinated players to play, leaked emails indicate they will now not need to share their vaccination status with tournament authorities. I spoke yesterday with NewsClick's Leslie Xavier for details on this developing story. What brings about, other than Novak Djokovic, this change in what was a clear stand now is a lot more ambiguous?
I think it was not just, of course, Novak Djokovic's star power is there, and it's also, I think the player council was involved in these discussions. The leaked email was, in fact, a correspondence between WTA and the player council. So there must have been some push from the players' union as such also, because it's the belief is that vaccination is a personal call and it shouldn't be forced upon. And of course, in the last 18 months or so, tournaments have been staged, and vaccination, for instance, even grand big event like the Tokyo Olympics, scale-wise as well, there was no clear rule that unvaccinated athletes won't be allowed into the system. So the idea is that the quarantine rules would negate the possibility of, if you're getting into a bubble and if you're doing a 14-day quarantine and post that you are within that bubble, that would negate the risk, some percentage of the risk that things would escalate into an infection or a cluster spread or whatever. Having said that, Australian Open would be a open event that way, because the country apparently is touching 90% vaccination status. So like the Cricket World Cup that is happening, also crowd are being allowed in Dubai, and Dubai has eased off a lot of, UAE has eased off a lot of restrictions, COVID restrictions, because vaccination has reached a certain saturation point, so to speak. Same thing will happen in Australia. So it's not like the players won't be exposed. So what the vaccination is supposed to do is keep yourself from remote chances of infection as well, because it's in that sense it's a respiratory disease, and you are within a crowded space and you're playing, and so unvaccinated players go in with that kind of a risk because the bubble is changed now. Bubble is not closed bubble where you are, so crowd is only watching it on TV, and only the people who are within that bubble are involved in the stadium. Not anymore. It's an open event, so there is always a risk. So their initial stance was made based on Australian government taking that decision based on the risks that are involved. Now easing off whatever the pressures are, maybe player, maybe sponsor, and it is a tricky call because if at all a cluster spread happens within or a spread happens inside.
Lots of challenges.
Lot of challenges. The tournament itself has a stake. The people who are involved in the tournament, the staff, the workers, the kids. I don't exactly know what the vaccination policy of Australia is as far as under 18 kids are concerned, and all the ball boys and support staff around the court would be.
I think things are being opened up, but we'll check on that. Yeah, but it's an important point that you brought up, whether it's pressure from players or from sponsors or from both. Because the argument is that players bring sponsors and then sponsor money drives everything else. So that's also why the link back to our show name. Because at the end of the day, the fact is that for a lot of people, there's a lot of money riding on this, and I think that is, from the tennis perspective at least, that is a dominant perspective.
And also
from the national perspective, I guess it's challenging because people looking at public health issues, Australia now, I mean, I personally have a ton of very close family there, and they have had to endure over the past 2 years a very, very hard, very strict lockdown where even travel between two states, for example, Sydney, where I have some family, and Melbourne, where the Australian Open takes place. Between the states of Victoria and New South Wales, travel was closed. The borders were shut. People have suffered tremendously through these lockdowns because of all of the day-to-day life and livelihood issues that it's brought up. And so for all of these people to have gone through this, and then to see these guys who all, in any case, because of their economic status and their social status, occupy bubbles, come in and take everything for sort of granted in a sense, and also perhaps put under some kind of threat. I'm not saying that everything will collapse because of 5 or 10 or 20, even 100 players, but they are putting what has been taken a lot of effort to maintain from a public perspective in some kind of jeopardy.
But it's an interesting email leak where you say the players who are unvaccinated or undeclared players, they can come in and do 14-day quarantine, which in itself is a deterrent because you are losing hard quarantine they are talking about. It's not like they could train. So players who come in, they're going off boil, clear. This issue had happened earlier where some players were treated with preference during the Australian Open itself earlier this year. Last Australian Open. So and some players couldn't train at all, and so I don't know. Now, I mean, it's a smart chess game of sorts because pressure came in, so you have to ease off the rule. Okay, we are easing off the rule, but this is our state's rule. And yeah, like you mentioned, it's the decision is not from the Australian government. The Victoria state government has to take this decision whether this should be allowed.
And finally, many of us have heard the story of Rosa Parks, the black activist who refused to give up her seat on a bus for a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama in December 1955. This act of resistance was a historic moment in the struggle for black people and in their resistance against segregation and racial discrimination. But what many of us may not know is that 9 months earlier, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was arrested for doing the same thing, refusing to relinquish her seat to a white woman on an overcrowded, segregated Montgomery bus. She has now approached the court with an interesting request. Prashant has more on this story. Prashant, who is Claudette Colvin, or what's her story and what is she seeking now?
All right, Siddhant, as you said, she was a 15-year-old in 1955, someone very deeply concerned about racial injustice. Like our viewers might know, at that point, segregation was a reality in large parts of the United States where there were separate sections for white people in separate sections for what are called the colored people. Buses, a common example.
Yeah.
So, and Rosa Parks' story is, of course, very famous. It's in textbooks across the world. The same thing Claudette Colvin did 9 months ago when a white woman wanted to take her seat in a colored section. Because the white section was full. She refused to get up, and then she was, beaten up by police officers. She was arrested, handcuffed, arrested at the very young age of 15, and she was imprisoned. So now the interesting thing is that now, in her 80s, she's approached the court asking for juvenile arrest record to be expunged, which is interesting because it kind of shows it's a legacy of an older time.
Yeah.
So while finally she didn't have to serve time in jail, but it was probation for many, many years, and she didn't know how long probation was. So she's asking for that record to be expunged, not as a symbolic point to make about the kind of struggles that she underwent as well as many people underwent. So Claudette Colvin's story now especially relevant because after all these years, the questions of the victories of the civil rights movement at that time still very much important. There are attempts by the Republicans in the United States to
roll back some of
many
that,
of
yeah.
these victories, especially in the area of voting. We have seen the kind of atrocities that take place on a day-to-day basis. George Floyd, of course, but also so many people, Elijah McClain, so many others who continue to be shot just for the crime of being black, for lack of a better word. So it's a good question to ask that there have been great gains, of course, since 15-year-old Claudette Colvin, inspired by a sense of justice, inspired by a sense of wanting to do the right thing, refused to give up a seat. But I think for people of America across the world, still a lot more questions about where that arc of justice is going to end and when it will. So interesting development. It's a small snapshot of a history many of us I think don't know about, need to know about, and also ask questions about when we look at today's world.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Prashant. That does it for our show today. You've been watching Daily Debrief. This is People's Dispatch. You can follow us on peoplesdispatch.org and all our social media platforms. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again, same time, same place tomorrow. Goodbye.